Welcome everyone. It's Wednesday, September 30th, our last day of September, and we are going to be diving into early childhood today. I'm correct in saying that your virtual child was due before class today, is that correct? Raising your child through age 5. So I'm going to pull up that the questions that I want you to reflect on in your small groups in just one moment. Hang tight, I want to pull it up accurately. All right, so we have, and I can see it, but you can't see it, hang tight. Okay, let me make it large for you guys. So these ages map onto the age period that we're going to be talking about further today with early childhood. And I want you to think about, at this stage of you raising your virtual child, has your virtual life said anything about your marriage relationship and how having small children might have affected it? Maybe there's some financial strain, for example, like job instability is often common, or someone got a promotion and you were able to move to a different neighborhood. These are some different experiences that might affect your marriage relationship. Keep an eye out, for example, I know statistically at least half of you are likely to end up divorced in this virtual simulation. So it's supposed to reflect real life. And you might want to take it seriously when your virtual simulation says, things are going south in that relationship, and maybe try and troubleshoot through that. I also want you to think about, how's your child's language skills progressing, their problem solving skills, motor skills, which we're going to talk about some milestones they reach with their motor skills later today. How do they do with other children? Because during this age is when children are commonly beginning to spend more time with their peer group than their caregivers. So they spend a larger proportion of the waking hours with peers and a teacher, as opposed to their immediate family members. Describe any activities your child is interested in. And if you and your partner had another child born recently, how has that affected this first child that is really the focal child of your virtual simulation? Do you feel like your child is prepared to enter kindergarten? Why or why not? And that could be for a variety of reasons, not just academically, but also perhaps socially. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pause our recording.
Dr. Flores, I believe you're muted.
Thank you. It automatically mutes me and I always forget that. Thank you, Magdalena. So I want to just remind you with your deadlines, if you ever miss a deadline with your virtual child, don't worry. Just make sure that you contact me via email so I can extend your deadline. The modules themselves are not worth, they're not technically worth credit, but you have to raise your virtual child and lead your virtual life to write your final paper. So you want to, kind of be doing that as you go. With the virtual modules, the other thing is that completing them in time is helpful because you can participate in these conversations and kind of compare your experience and your child to other people's kids and what's going on with their children. So it was interesting to listen to some of your reflections on your experience with the virtual modules. Some of you have like ideal children and other people have more aggressive kids. And I just keep an eye out for the fact that that aggression could or could not turn into a bigger problem later. I know in my virtual modules, I've had a child who has ADHD, and that was something that I had to constantly think about whether I was going to get the child involved in therapy or offer them medication or a combination of both. So sometimes that can be an early symptom of later issues. So just keep an eye out for that. I'm glad that most of your children are doing well or transitioning well if they have younger siblings. And it seems like so far, I haven't talked to anyone in a group who's had a marriage issue. Is that, it seems like everyone's so far so good.
I got divorced.
Oh, you already got divorced and you have
Yeah.
two small
I
kids.
have two kids, yeah, so they'll spend their weekends with their dad and the weeks with me, and it was so sad.
How did that, did it just happen out of the blue or did you have any warning signs before you were notified?
I want to say that the little virtual wife was saying, "Oh, you and your partner are having problems, but you're trying to work through it." And then just one day it was like, "Yeah, you and your partner are separated. He's living in the house down the street from you."
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's already happening, though it could happen at a later age too. So if people still have intact marriages, you just have to be, vigilant, I guess, as these problems arise. Sometimes you'll have an option to do counseling with your partner, and other times you won't. So yeah, it's can be sad. But these are things that also being a single parent can be really different in how you are able to navigate or the opportunities you're able to afford your child in that situation. So, yeah, here we go. Things are getting real. We will be talking about divorce, but I don't think we talk about it until maybe middle childhood, those chapters. One thing that changes at this point with our textbook, as you might have noticed, we're not breaking it up between physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional. Instead, it's like physical and cognitive, and then socio-emotional is separate. So each stage will have 2 chapters instead of 3, like infancy and toddler had 3 separate chapters. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right. I'm going to close this document down for now. We're going to start talking about early childhood, which I think is a really cool period of development. I want you to think too that it's interesting right now for children in this stage of development, somewhere between 3 and 5, because they would have these experiences out in public. I already mentioned that, you start to spend more time with peers or teachers or maybe a daycare instructor. You spend more waking hours with them than perhaps your own immediate family members. This has obviously been complicated since COVID has happened, because now a lot of parents are juggling both childcare or homeschooling and their own careers, which is creating a lot of tension that doesn't typically happen at this stage of development for parents. So they start to, children start to become more independent, but that's not necessarily happening right now in the world. So it'll be really interesting how this can perhaps impact young children during this stage of life when they would normally be more so around peers. They might have some delays in social skills, for example. But physically, what's going on is that their overall physical growth is still happening, but it's not as rapid as the earlier 2 stages. We had seen a graph, I believe, where the slope of growth for infancy is super steep, and then it flattens out a little bit for toddlerhood, and then even more so within early childhood. They're still growing, but they're not growing as rapidly. And their bodies start to take on a more streamlined, thin, more similar to an adult's body. So their head, for example, is not as large of a proportion of their entire body. So they start to begin to look more adult-like. And a lot of parents will say, I no longer have a baby, I have a little girl or a little boy. And it's just this like shift into becoming a kid rather than a baby or a toddler. There's some individual differences in size between like girls and boys can become more apparent, or just simply because they have the genes to be taller given who their parents are. So some individual differences, like having a short child versus a tall child, start to become more obvious than they were at toddlerhood or during infancy. Their overall posture and balance begin to improve, and we'll talk about some things that are happening in the brain that cause this shift in a future slide. But overall, they have smoother motor coordination than they did as a toddler. We saw, if you ever observe a toddler, for example, they can be quite clumsy, they fall a lot, and they're kind of built for that rough and tumble fall. They oftentimes will have bruises where they fell, hit their head, which is not too uncommon, but it's less likely that these errors happen during early childhood when they become much more coordinated in their motor movements. The other interesting thing with their skeletal growth is that the epiphyses emerge, and these are those rounded ends of our bones that begin to take shape. So before that, it's just like a very straight, flat bone, and they don't have these like kind of knobs at the end of the bones that begin to emerge and can perhaps, like as kids go through growth spurts, can feel like a little painful. If you remember being a little kid having your legs hurt when you would go through a growth spurt, that's pretty common for kids during this age. They also will begin to maybe lose their baby teeth during this stage. And so it's really important for parents to be vigilant about dental care, because as they lose their baby teeth, maybe at the end of kindergarten, beginning of first grade, they'll start to lose a couple teeth, and they need to be really consistent with cleaning their teeth. Otherwise, the damage that happens during that time will stay with them as an adult, because these are their adult teeth that are going to begin growing in their mouths. Another really interesting thing that happens, and sometimes can emerge earlier when they begin to eat, is that children begin to favor one hand over the other. This is called handedness. And so they either will pick up a crayon or a writing utensil with their right hand or their left hand. And statistically, we know that 90% of the human population are right-handed. And this means that, all of their speech, comprehension and production are housed in their left hemisphere, because everything that happens on the right side of the body is processed contralaterally, or on the opposite side of the brain. So if you're right-handed, everything you do with your right hand that's creating activation in your left hemisphere. And usually your speech, your language, everything is housed in the left hemisphere when you're right-handed. This isn't entirely true for people who are left-handed. They tend to have bilateral activation of language in both hemispheres. They're a minority of the population, and it's interesting because if you're left-handed, I don't know how many of you are left-handed out there, but they're disproportionately represented in American presidents and Nobel Prize winners. Tend to have a higher proportion of being left-handed. So there's something really interesting about the organization of the brain that might be a cognitive advantage for children who are left-handed in the long run. So that's kind of something interesting. So this is influenced both by nature and nurture, your handedness. We know in the past, historically, certain cultures have believed, even in the United States, that being left-handed meant something evil about you. And so teachers, parents might try and punish children who are left-handed and get them to favor their right hands. Now, that's no longer really the norm, luckily. So we don't have as many nurture influences trying to encourage a child to use their right hand over their left hand. But you are more likely, nature speaking or genetically speaking, to be left-handed if you have a family member who is left-handed. So we know that there's something genetic about being a lefty. It's less likely to happen if both of your parents, for example, are right-handed. One thing we know that's interesting about the nurture component is the position of you as a baby in the uterus might have something to do with whether you're right or left-handed. The average baby tends to be, if they're positioned head down, they tend to have their right hand free to explore their first environment, which is the uterus. And they're also listening largely with, they have their right facing out, so they listen and process all the speech on the left hemisphere. So using that right hand, being able to hear through the right ear, you're processing all of that in the left hemisphere, which is why the average baby may be more inclined to be right-handed and have language organized in the left hemisphere. But if a child's positioned in a different way so that they're able to explore their environment more so with their left hand, then they might become left-handed. So that's something interesting about nurture, or that first environment that a child is in, that could potentially shape whether they are left or right-handed. So that practice of exploring that environment with their left or right hand might make them more inclined to become a lefty or a righty. Certainly practice, we know in the past with different cultures being really strict and not encouraging of left-handed people, that with practice they could become right-handed or ambidextrous, where they use both their right and left hand. But of course, we have these natural inclinations that first appear as a toddler when you're feeding yourself, right? When you have the option of using your right or left hand to manipulate a spoon or to brush your teeth. These are some early signs of handedness even before early childhood.
Dr. Flores, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm ambidextrous, but when I was little, I used like both of my hands.
Okay.
But I noticed that my little sister also uses both of her hands. She doesn't really have a preference for either one. So is that like a sign that she will be ambidextrous as well, or is she kind of just figuring it out?
It could be both, because I think we do test things out. I mean, if you ever want to really recognize how, what's the word I'm looking for? How dedicated your brain is to one hand or the other, try brushing your teeth with the opposite hand. It's such a weird experience. But, initially I think that children might test things out a little bit and gain a preference for one hand over the other. But if she continues to use both hands, especially at this period of time during early childhood, I think toddlerhood and infancy, it can be quite malleable. Around early childhood is when, remember, there's a lot of synaptic pruning happening in the brain. So if they haven't used that hand, they lose that specificity of, favoring that hand in this respect. So they'll only use the hand that they've routinely practiced using over and over again. It can be really hard to train yourself to be ambidextrous. So it's rare that that happens unless you just do actually naturally have no preference for one or the other. So I don't know if that helped answer your question, but it might depend on how old your younger sister is.
Yeah, thank you. She's 3.
Yeah, so take a look at how she's doing in preschool, maybe 4 or 5. If she has a specific preference, then it might be cemented by then. Or she might really be ambidextrous. So like I was talking about with synapses, because at this point, your brain is pruning away synapses that you're not going to use so that it can become more efficient and streamlined in your cognition. The other thing that's happening simultaneously is a greater myelination of these neurons. Remember, myelin is, these myelin sheaths are fatty tissue that wrap around the axon and speed up communication between neurons. So having greater myelination, it actually makes your brain functioning much faster, in addition to the fact that there's going to be fewer synaptic connections as it prunes away different dendrites that are no longer needed. One part of your brain that becomes quite important is your amygdala. Amygdala is Greek for almond. So you have 2 almond-shaped amygdalas in your right and left hemispheres, and they process emotional information, kind of, like, should I be afraid of this? Is this, how does this make me feel? It kind of is tasting incoming emotional content and information. So when we feel really upset about something, we can be pretty confident that our amygdala is acting, is very much activated at that moment. Similarly, even if we're happy, like this is all different emotional experiences in which your amygdala would be activated. So in this little, here we go, this image over to the right, we can see the amygdala. It looks like a little orange thing kind of right behind what I imagine is the hippocampus. Yeah, it is the hippocampus. And the cerebellum in the back of our brain is oftentimes called the tiny brain or the little brain. It's one of the oldest evolutionary parts of our brain. So it's has a lot of basic functions, such as allowing us to be able to balance, control our body movement, be more coordinated. And this is something that's becoming further myelinated during this early childhood period, which is why children are able to move with more agility and smoothness. Their gait or their stride is much more effortless instead of the clumsy type of stride you oftentimes see toddlers possess. And all of this has to do with the myelination that's happening within the cerebellum. Similarly, the hippocampus, this blue area kind of central to our brain, and it's subcortical or beneath the cerebral cortex. This part of our brain is really, really useful for our memory, for creating new memories, and it's being myelinated during early childhood, allowing us to remember things that happened to us, perhaps in preschool, in daycare, or with a babysitter, or maybe even just entering kindergarten are some of our early memories. Before this period of time, when our hippocampus is not fully myelinated, we have a really hard time conjuring up memories when we were 1 or 2 or an infant, right? This is what we call infantile amnesia. Prior to the myelination of the hippocampus, we really don't remember a lot because we need this part of our brain to be myelinated in order to create meaningful memories. The other really interesting thing about the hippocampus is that we tend to code our memories in linguistic form. So, that allows us to recall something that happened to us and then tell about it. And since children before early childhood have very basic or rudimentary language, they might not even be speaking in full sentences. It's hard for them to code their memories in a meaningful way, which is why we might not remember also things that have happened to us before age 3 or 4. We have that, infantile amnesia because our hippocampus isn't fully myelinated and we don't have really complex, meaningful language skills. Okay, so influences on our physical growth. We have a pituitary gland within our brain that releases 2 different types of hormones that initiate or trigger growth in our bodies. Our pituitary gland is going to first release growth hormone or GH. This is really necessary for all growth in our body tissues and our cells within our body. The only thing it's not responsible for is growth in our central nervous system, meaning our brain and our spinal cord, and also our genitals are not dictated by this specific hormone, the growth hormone. But it will, pediatricians might be concerned if a child or an adolescent isn't within range for their age. They might be worried about this growth hormone, whether the pituitary gland is releasing it or not, if it's not able to create it. This might explain why a child is abnormally smaller than the rest of their peers. The thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, is what is really responsible for normal brain growth. So both of these hormones, since the child is not going through puberty at this time, they don't need the genitals to be stimulated in a particular way. What they only need is their body to grow and their brain to continue growing during this time. So GH and TSH are the most critical hormones that are guiding that process of normal growth that is fairly slow at this stage of development. So what are some new things that kids are doing during early childhood? We know just like children in toddlerhood, they can walk, they can run, they're jumping just like toddlers learn how to jump near the end of toddlerhood, but they're also doing things that require some hand-eye coordination, like catching balls, for example. Swinging is a very complex coordinated event in which you're kind of moving your body forward and back and pumping your legs, and so it can take a while for children to realize how to swing on a swing at a playground. This is something that tends to happen during early childhood. Riding a bicycle is something that happens during usually the end of early childhood, around age 5 or so. Again, very complex because they have to use their cerebellum, that part of their brain, that tiny brain in the back, to be able to balance enough on a two-wheeler without training wheels and pump their legs, going forward, while also hopefully being vigilant about any dangers around them. So it's a very complex motor movement for children in early childhood, but they can master it at this stage. So that, they need improved balance that is dictated by their cerebellum. They need that smooth gait that becomes, it's kind of rhythmic by age 2, but it's much smoother beyond age 2. And their upper and lower body skills combine into just much more refined actions by age 5, which allows them to master riding a two-wheeler. I don't know if you've ever tried to teach anyone how to ride a two-wheeler bike. I actually had to do this with a friend in graduate school who was never taught how to ride a two-wheel bike. So I'm teaching my friend who's around 30 how to do this in a parking lot. It's quite complicated, even for someone of advanced age to learn, but it's fairly remarkable that their brains are primed to learn this complex skill by early childhood. They have much greater speed and endurance, so they'll be able to play for much longer periods of time without being tired out. And so to shift away from all these amazing gross motor skills that are advancing during early childhood, they also have increased ability with their fine motor skills. Remember, using their fingers and their hands to do things such as dressing themselves, feeding themselves, and then tying their shoe happens either at the end of early childhood or the beginning of middle childhood. So tying a shoe, usually in kindergarten, they're really focused on them being able to use their hands to do this themselves. In fact, teachers will even ask parents to stop sending their child to school in Velcro shoes so that they have to practice this fine motor skill, this complex fine motor skill to tie the laces and tighten them so that they can move around in their shoes. So that's a huge benchmark or milestone for young children in early childhood. They also begin drawing in a much more purposeful way. So at the beginning of early childhood, what we see in this image is there's a lot of tadpole people. They have just a head, maybe some legs coming out of their head. This is the predecessor of representing humans. But again, they might not have a torso, or they might not have arms. Their arms might sprout right out of their legs, or their head. So they roughly represent humans, but not as accurately as by the end of early childhood. We start to see facial features that are more precise, arms, hands. We start to see more detail in animals, for example, to have like 4 legs and a tail and ears and all of these detailed features. So their representation of animals and life, humans, becomes a little bit more detailed and precise by the end of early childhood. One thing that's kind of interesting is that in our culture in the United States, we leave a lot of this to chance. We don't provide a lot of guidance in how to draw. But in other cultures, such as Chinese culture, they have a very specific, detailed curriculum for drawing in their culture that starts at a very early age. And so we do see with some training and guidance that children become much more detailed and skilled at drawing than in other cultures where it's not a priority to teach that as a skill in your curriculum. All right, early childhood nutrition. As children progress into early childhood, they start to either become pickier or they don't need to eat as often. They might get distracted, for example, by playing and say, I'm not hungry, or maybe they're just using snacks as a way to get through the day so that they don't have to eat something that they don't want to, like vegetables. So they might, you have to be careful as a parent that you're not giving your children too many snacks and they're not getting the full balanced nutrition that is needed at this time. Because if they don't eat as often, this can suppress their immune system, making them more vulnerable to getting sick. And since they're spending a lot more time with peers and other children, they're oftentimes coming home with a variety of illnesses, or it seems like they're always cycling through a cold at some point. And at least providing a more balanced, nutritious diet for them can help kind of decrease the likelihood that they're getting sick as often. So they oftentimes become wary of new foods at this stage, like they don't want to try that suspicious looking vegetable or fruit that you're introducing to them. They'd rather have old reliable meals that they know they already like. But what's interesting about their diet at this time, because of the way that they're growing at kind of a slower rate and they're reflecting more of an adult-like body, they need diets that are more balanced and lower in overall fat, but higher in like vegetables and fruits. So you want to make sure you're limiting fats, oils, salts, and sugar in their diet, because it could actually, depending on how much sugar you have in their diet, it could encourage them to act out in not pleasant ways. So we do know there is some relation between like the diet of the child and when they have maybe attention or behavioral issues that could potentially be helped with an improvement in the child's diet. They hopefully are starting to imitate some adult food choices, which is a good thing if the parents are eating nutritiously, but a bad thing if the parents are actually modeling bad diet practices. So not eating enough of their vegetables and fruits, and having a lot of takeout food or unhealthy food, or desserts all the time, for example. We do know that, again, I mentioned this earlier, that if they have a poor quality diet, it's more likely to be associated or correlated with cognitive deficits, meaning they are not able to pay attention as well, have a shorter attention span overall, or behavior problems, acting out, perhaps being aggressive, for example. So if these things happen when your child is starting in preschool or kindergarten, you might want to reevaluate their overall diet and see if you can't introduce more nutritious foods into their diet. I'm going to take a drink for a moment, talking for a while. Any questions out there before I jump into immunizations and vaccines? I know this is a loaded conversation that you've already written a lot about, so we aren't going to spend too much time on it. Because in reading your papers, I was aware that you really dove deep into this topic. So children, oftentimes in the United States, you are aware now that they oftentimes lack their immunizations, or they haven't been vaccinated for against a variety of viruses and diseases that are communicable or contagious and potentially life-threatening. Some of the reasons include that the family might not have access to healthcare, so the cost of getting this whole battery of vaccines is very costly for the family that doesn't have health care. And they might try and prolong getting these vaccines until they can afford them, or they are mandated to have them for the child to enter public school, for example. I know I've had a lot of friends mention, especially working parents, that it's really stressful to constantly be going back to the pediatrician for a lot of vaccines. So sometimes just the busyness of life can prolong when the parent is able to vaccinate their child. That's one reason they might not be up to snuff on their immunizations. And of course, what we covered in our paper altogether, there's a lot of misconceptions about vaccine safety. A lot of you mentioned in your papers that people are worried about aluminum or mercury in these vaccines that are at negligible amounts that would not affect or trigger the presence of autism, but it's really hard. It's like what Andrew Wakefield did in his publication is kind of like squeezing toothpaste out of a toothpaste I don't know, tube, and you can't put it back in. It's hard to put it back in. So he's introduced this idea, even though it's not true, that vaccines are associated with autism. And once it's been put out there, especially in a professional sense, because he was a scientist and a doctor, it's really hard to erase that idea from people's minds, which a lot of you guys talked about in relation to the podcast you listened to. We also don't want to forget, there's his retracted publication there, that a lot of parents may be a part of a religion that has philosophical objections to vaccinating their children. So I believe, I'm trying to think, Scientology, I believe, is one of those religions in which they don't believe in medical interventions near the end of life, or in the case of immunizations to prevent death. But there's more than just that one religion that has that stance. So that's one thing that can be attributed to not having children vaccinated. Okay, so now we're shifting a bit away from physical growth into cognitive development of children in early childhood. So it's only fitting that we talk about Piaget and his observations of his own 3 children that motivated his developmental theory of cognition. And during this stage in early childhood, children from 3 to 6 are in the pre-operational stage, according to Piaget. So technically, he even began this stage at age 2, but remember, the confines of early childhood are roughly around 3 to 6. So children have huge gains in mental representation, which allows them to play make-believe. They start taking on sociodramatic play, where they might, for example, one of them might be the teacher, and one of them, and other children that they're playing with might be students, and they play out this role. They're able to imagine through the use of mental representation that someone has a different role. Now, I'm always curious to ask at this point, like some different things you might have played when you were in early childhood. I can tell you some strange examples on my part, but I'm always curious to hear your examples too. So I know with my sister, my younger sister, I kind of forced her into a lot of my make-believe play. And one of them was that we played like dentist's office, and I had, kind of a list of different procedures that that the children or that people could get, these make-believe hypothetical patients we had. And we had, we had like little carbon copy receipts that we could write out how much people owed us for different procedures that they had done. And we even kept a schedule of who was coming in that day. These are all, of course, just make-believe people, right? But I'm curious what other types of make-believe play you and your friends, maybe your siblings or neighborhood friends, played. So I'm gonna check the chat. Yeah, I was kind of a weird kid. I also played like I was, I don't know, a real estate agent, and I created all these model homes. I drew the facade of them, and this was maybe a little bit further into middle adulthood, middle childhood. But I used a computer software to create blueprints for homes, and then I would sell them. It was really crazy. I don't know, but my make-believe play became very advanced at some point. A real estate agent, I know, it's a first. You would play ninjas, all right, with your brother. Did either of you take martial arts, or was it all just kind of make believe?
Yeah, so when we were younger, we would just kind of play with, I don't know, fake little toy swords and chase each other around the house. Probably not safe, but we did that. And then when we got a little bit older, like 6 and 7, and my oldest brother was maybe like 13 at the time, we started taking karate lessons. But when we were little,
Okay.
we would just like play fight.
Yeah, I feel like this was really common too, because when I was a kid, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were big. So playing Ninja Turtles or Ninja was pretty common among a lot of boys, but especially if you had a brother, it might be common for you as well. Any other ideas, thoughts? Oh yeah, imitating life with your Barbie and Ken dolls. Maybe like I know I was at a babysitter, not at a daycare, and I saw a lot of soap operas during the day that came to life in my Barbie like world as a kid. So that's also very common. Let me see.
Me and my brothers, we would pretend that we were dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs? That's a new one. How would you do that?
Yeah. As on my older brother was a T-Rex, and I was like the little smaller dinosaur. And we would just fight. How my
That's
wife.
awesome.
Yeah,
Do
I
you
got
have
some
any
pictures.
like costumes that were
Oh,
dinosaurs or no?
not costumes. I mean, we couldn't really afford them, but we would just like pretend. You know what I mean? And, like
Yeah,
even like not pretend, but like also like with the miniature toys that we had of dinosaurs. That's what we would like use. Man.
that's awesome. I know a lot of movies would motivate our make-believe play. And when I was little, the movie Swiss Family Robinson was really big. And so when we played outside, we would gather plants and make, meal concoctions and pretend we were Swiss Family Robinson, or we were living like out in the wilderness, trying to get by. Let's see, I'm looking into the chat real quick. Played a game called Sandwich where we would take all the couch pillows and stack them up on top of each other. Not on our faces though. My brothers and I would imitate wrestlers from TV and create our own storylines. Yeah, we played restaurant too. Oh, very cool. Yeah, so like a lot of these different types of make-believe play can be motivated by things we see perhaps on television or hobbies we're into, or they also reflect real life experiences like playing restaurant or dentist office. These are things that you would have some limited experience with, that you could then try and emulate these real life things that are happening, such as playing a school as well. So there's a lot of symbol to real world relations that are happening. And whether you have like the costumes to actually try and act out these things or not, it doesn't matter, because you can become really creative with a few resources around you. And that's a huge strength of children in early childhood, is they don't need to have like a whole box of dress up clothes or things like that. They can really enact a lot of these different make-believe worlds with limited resources because they have really great mental representation. Some of the limitations, however, oh, was there a question? Or maybe I just heard something. Okay. Some limitations in children's thinking at this time, according to Piaget, is egocentrism. They're still very self-focused. They have a hard time fully understanding, especially at the beginning of early childhood, that you have a unique and different perspective from me. They still haven't entirely wrapped their mind around that. They still, and to some extent, believe that the world revolves around them. So that's one limitation we're going to see depicted here in some future slides. They're not able to conserve, which has more to do with their understanding of like physics and real life, objects, I guess. And I'll also show you a video depiction of their lack of conservation as well. They also have a hard time understanding the hierarchy of classification, that roses and daisies and tulips, they're all part of this larger hierarchy known as flowers. So they don't have really great hierarchical classification yet. And at the beginning of early childhood, near the end, they start to get a little bit better at understanding hierarchy of classification, but it takes time and they're really not good at it at the beginning of early childhood. So we're going to dive deep into egocentrism first, which I first mentioned as a limitation during the pre-operational stage of Piaget's cognitive developmental theory. So this child here is engaged in the picture in a classic paradigm testing egocentrism. So they put a doll at the opposite end of the table, and the doll can see something totally different on this table than the girl herself, the child who's in early childhood. If they ask, for example, and they put a lot of things in the table in front of the little girl, can the doll on the opposite side see those things? Most children at the beginning of early childhood will say yes. Their view of this mountain on the table is exactly the same as the view that the child has themselves. They don't understand that this doll would have a different perspective of this table. And that depicts, again, the fact that they still struggle with being more egocentric in nature. I'm going to show you a second classic experiment that tests children's egocentrism. And it is called the false belief task. So we're going to see an example of this in the video here that I'm going to share.
Fresh, and the last thing you want is to run out. With City Market,
You're gonna have a tea party with Play-Doh. I wanna serve myself. Here, Sarah. No!
Well, you've probably discovered that however smart your 3-year-old is, she doesn't seem able to put herself in someone else's mental shoes, to imagine how they think and what they believe. Perhaps you thought your parenting skills were to blame, but scientists suggest that understanding other minds is a skill that may not be fully developed until a child is about 4. To learn how children's social skills evolve between about 3 and 4, researchers use something called a false belief test.
What do you think's in this box? Looks fairly obvious, doesn't it? Crayons. But let me show you. I filled it full of candles. All right, now I close it up again. While you and I have been having this conversation, Snoopy has been down here asleep. Doesn't know what we've talked about. But let's bring him into the conversation. Now I have another question for you. What do you think Snoopy will say if I ask him what's in this box? Crayons, obviously. What else could anybody possibly say? Well, watch this 3-year-old.
What do you think is inside this box? Let's open it up and see.
Candles.
Now, you can ask the child what appears to be a very simple question about that. What did you think was inside the box when you first saw it? They say, oh, I always thought that there were candles in this box. Then you can ask them about someone else. So you can ask them about Snoopy. Snoopy's been sitting here. He hasn't seen this box. He's never seen us open it up.
What does Snoopy think is inside this box?
Candles.
Children say the same thing. Snoopy will think there are candles inside of this box. And what that indicates is that the children's view of how minds work is very, very different from the view that you and I would have.
Yes. Did you see it?
In the mind of the 3-year-old, everyone sees the world much the same way. There's no difference between what I think and believe and what everyone else, including Snoopy, thinks and believes. It is, in a sense, a naive and innocent view of the world, a kind of mental Eden. And then, about 4, comes the fall from grace.
Now, if you take a 4-year-old, quite typically the 4-year-old will tell you that, as a matter of fact, he thought there were crayons in the box. And then he found out that there were candles in the box. You can ask him about Snoopy, and he'll say, oh, no, Snoopy will think that there are crayons in this box.
Great. Why will he think that?
Because it's a crayon box.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And that's going to make him think they're crayons. What's really in the box?
Candles.
Right.
And then you get the 5-year-olds who are just utterly blasé and think that this is such an obvious thing, it's silly even to ask the question. What that shows is that by the time children are 4 and 5, they have a view of the mind that looks much more like our view of the mind. They understand that things can be tricky and deceptive, that you can change your mind, that things aren't always the way that they seem. And that gives them a very different vision of how the mind works and how people work.
Remember, we're sharing this. Oh, I need that. And then it's my turn.
Children who pass the false belief test now understand that other people can have different beliefs, even mistaken beliefs. Some scientists suggest that this test is further evidence of innate brain circuits specialized for reading other people's minds. They call it a theory of mind mechanism.
All right.
I'm Lauren Boebert, a small business owner, a mom, a Coloradan fed up with far-left Washington.
Okay. Whew. Can't wait to be done with the political commercials here one day soon. Okay, I'm going to get back to our lecture to focus on the whole aim here. So what we saw there was the 3-year-old thought that the box of crayons contained crayons, but once he was shown that there were candles in there, he said, no, I always knew that there were candles in there. And he even believes that this other person, Snoopy, a hypothetical person, of course, would also believe that there were candles in the box, not crayons. And this shifts very suddenly from age 3 to 4 and 5, where children start to have a different perspective. They understand that Snoopy might have a mistaken belief that there are actually crayons in the box when there are candles in the box. And so this is very much related to the false belief task, where, you know, it's possible for other people to have false beliefs or false understandings of the world. And once they understand that we have different perspectives, that Snoopy could believe there are crayons in that box, or that this child in this image here could be seeing something different about this mountain paradigm than the doll on the other side, it seems that children begin to understand this theory of mind, in which I have a unique and different perspective than you, who has a unique and different perspective than the other person next to them, that we all can have a different, unique perspective, which before age 4 is not the case. They think everyone has the same perspective and information that they do. They believe the world is kind of omniscient, that everyone has the same knowledge as that child themselves. Another challenge for children at the beginning of early childhood is this concept of conservation that was defined by Piaget. And so children are put into a variety of tasks in which they're asked, you know, which line of pennies are they the same, or is there one that has more pennies, for example? And just simply by spacing out the pennies on the top row will incline a child at the age of 3 to believe that there's more pennies in that top row just because it's a longer line of pennies. They don't take the time there to sit and count out each penny in each row. They just see this change that makes them believe there's more pennies in the top row. I'm gonna focus in, after we watch this video, talking about these concepts of centration and irreversibility, but don't worry about them just yet. I wanna show you an example of a child who has not mastered conservation yet. So he's around age 3. He's very smart. You can tell he's able to explain his ideas very clearly, but he still doesn't get the concept of conservation.
If Boebert isn't willing to break from her party to get things done for Colorado, all we're going to get is more gridlock.
GoGuardian Teacher provides a digital window into student online activity, so teachers can see what students are doing.
Okay.
Rows of quarters. Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? Okay, now watch. Now, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
That one has more quarters.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does that one have more quarters?
Because it's stretched out.
Because it's stretched out?
Yes.
Okay, so how many are in this room?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, how many are in this room?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So, are there more in this row, or are they the same?
The same.
The same?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we have 2 sticks. Is this stick longer? Is this stick longer, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? What about now? Is this stick longer? Is this stick longer, or are they the same?
That stick is longer.
The stick is longer?
Yeah.
Can you tell me why?
Because you moved it over.
So now it's longer.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me. I'm gonna pour blue water into each of these cups, and you're gonna have to tell me when they have the same amount, okay? Okay, tell me when this one is the same.
The same.
The same? Those 2 are the same now?
Yeah.
Okay. They're the same? Good?
The white is the same.
Good. Okay, now watch this. We're gonna take the blue water from this glass, and we're gonna pour it into this glass. Now, does this glass have more water? Does this glass have more water, or are they the same?
Has more water.
This one has more water?
Yeah.
Can you tell me why?
Because that one's higher than that one.
That one's higher than that one. Right. Can you tell me, does this ball have more Play-Doh? Does this ball have more Play-Doh, or are they the same?
That one has more Play-Doh.
That one has more?
Yeah.
Let's try and make them the same. Make them 2 of the same size. What about now?
They're the same.
They're the same now?
Yeah.
Okay, now watch. Now, does this one have more Play-Doh? Does this one have more Play-Doh, or are they the same?
That one has more Play-Doh.
That one has more Play-Doh? Can you tell me why?
You smushed that one.
Because that one's smushed. How about now? Does this one have more Play-Doh? Does this one have more Play-Doh, or are they the same?
The same.
Now they're the same. Why are they the same?
You roll that one back up.
Okay, great. Okay. Did we share the graham crackers fair? Is this fair?
Yes.
Yes? Can you tell me why it's fair?
You have one and I do.
I have 1?
You have 2 and I have 1.
Is that fair?
No.
No? How about now?
Now that's fair.
Now that's fair? Why is that fair?
You have 2 and I have 2.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you could see that little boy, you know, he could even count out the number of quarters and realize they were the same, but he was still tricked by them being stretched out. He was tricked even in that case with the cracker where she broke his 1 piece into 2 pieces, and now they each had 2 pieces, but he kind of didn't know how to explain that they were 2 different quantities. He still said, okay, I guess that's fair now, right? There's 2 things he's not able to do here in those tasks we saw. So one is he's only focusing on one aspect of the problem and not paying attention to all the other aspects. Now with the liquid, for example, being poured into a different shaped glass, he never thought, for example, that, you know, there was no water taken out of the original glass and put into the next glass. Instead, he's only focusing on the height of the liquid, and he only focuses on that one feature. I'm looking into our chat. Yeah, Abraham, you feel bad watching her rip that half and him saying, okay, now it's fair, because they only focus on one aspect, the number of objects they have. And they don't focus on the whole thing, that they're a different size, and so it's not fair, right? So that aspect of centration, only focusing on one feature, You know, when she had the Play-Doh and she smashed it out flat, she didn't take any away, but all he could focus on was kind of the shape, and that ball was a little bit taller than the flattened out piece. He didn't begin to think that, you know, nothing was taken away, and he was only focusing on the shape. He also has an inability to reverse her actions, so he has irreversibility. He doesn't notice, for example, that if she put, you know, balls up that Play-Doh back into the same shape, she didn't add anything new to that Play-Doh, so it was always the same amount. So his inability to reverse her actions is another thing that tricks him or prevents him from mastering conservation in this situation. Keep in mind that he's about 3 years old, or at the beginning of early childhood, so this is really a difficult thing for him to master at the beginning of early childhood. Typically by the end of early childhood, just like we saw with that false belief task, there's a switch that flips and he thinks it's silly that she would ask him these questions. Of course, it's still the same amount, but at the beginning of early childhood, children really, really struggle with this concept of conservation. All right, so some things I'm going to be focusing in on Monday when we get together. I'll be talking about some advances in episodic memory. This is a type of memory when you're able to tell stories about things that have happened to you in your life. It's kind of like your own personal memories of your own life. And that's something that improves during this span of time because, again, remember, we talked about the myelination of the hippocampus that helps improve our memories, and also the advances in language that help improve the details of our memories. We also just touched on theory of mind in that false belief task before. So understanding that people have different unique perspectives from yourself is something that really does differentiate a child in early childhood, at the end of early childhood, from being at the beginning of early childhood. They begin to be less egocentric. And this is something that I want to pose to you all. I know we're in the last minute here of class. What condition or diagnosis might have challenges with understanding other unique perspectives? Does anyone have a guess at what developmental disorder has lags or delays in developing this theory of mind? They eventually get it. They understand that people have different unique perspectives, but it takes them much longer to master a theory of mind. Yes, Jacqueline, so autism. They have those lags in language and also in theory of mind. They stay egocentric for a much longer period of time than the average normal developing child. And then last, I'm gonna also talk about emergent literacy, and these are the types of skills that precede their ability to read. So all the different understanding of how a book works, you know, how you read from left to right, how you flip a page, where you would locate an author's name on a book. These are all emergent literacy skills that precede a child's ability to actually read for themselves. And with that, I'm going to pick up with episodic memory on Monday. I will stop sharing my screen and hang around for a moment to see if there's any questions. Otherwise, you're free to go. I'll see you all on Monday. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank